Hey guys, welcome back to Kevin Wilson SBC. I want to have one last video on driveline angles. And in this video, we're going to clear up a lot of things from my previous videos on pinion angle, drive shaft angles, engine transmission angles. We're going to talk about it. Let's jump in. Thank you for your support of the channel. Thank you for subscribing. Please comment. Please give me a thumbs up. Let's jump in and finalize driveline angles in drag racing. Okay, we're back on the chalkboard, and this is very rudimentary, but let's cover some very basic principles around pinion angle and relationship to engine and transmission angle. So here's the front of the car, here's the engine angles, here's the pinion angles. I just want to cover real quick non-uniform velocity. What that means is if the engine and transmission working angle at the yoke of the drive shaft is very different, or more than 1 to 2.5 degrees different than the working angle of the pinion yoke and drive shaft, then you will have non-uniform velocity. There is a link in the description of the video where Spicer does a much better job than me on explaining non-uniform velocity. But if the angle of the working angle on the pinion side of the drive shaft is more than 1 to 2 degrees different than the engine transmission yoke working angle, then you're going to have one end of the drive shaft spinning at a different velocity than the other end of the drive shaft. And that is not good. I say 1 to 2 degrees of difference because I'm talking about drag cars dedicated to the drag strip. I'm generally not talking about street-driven cars in my videos. My videos are geared towards drag cars, drag racing. Yes, these same principles apply to street-driven vehicles, but there's a lot more forgiveness in some of this stuff on street-driven vehicles than dedicated drag cars. So non-uniform velocity is talking about the engine and transmission driveline centerline and the pinion driveline centerline under load going down the track. These should be parallel to one another. So here's where the engine and transmission is tilted down towards the rear of the car. Your pinion under load should be offsetting and parallel to the center line of the engine and transmission. I have a lot of people contacting me with 4.5 to 5 degrees of downward engine transmission pinion angle for dedicated drag cars, and I don't like that. The right way to set up an engine and transmission is to point the engine and the transmission center line to the pinion yoke. And we generally like to have the engine and transmission level, or maybe just a tad pointing up to the pinion yoke, which means that the crankshaft center line is actually a tad lower than the pinion yoke, and the drive shaft is coming uphill to the pinion. Look at this situation right here. Here is representing a level, a 0 degree engine and transmission angle. And under load, I want the pinion to be parallel to the engine and transmission. If your engine and transmission is pointing up to the rear of the car, like this, then under load, the pinion needs to be parallel to the center line of the engine and transmission angle. But you have to take into consideration under load. So when I talk about setting pinion angle, I'm taking into consideration all of these working angles. And one more thing, You cannot and should not ignore your drive shaft angle in all of these calculations. I see a lot of comments where people are like, I could care less what the drive shaft angle is. I just need to know what my engine and transmission angle is, and I need to know that under acceleration, my pinion needs to be parallel. The pinion center line needs to be parallel. I understand what you mean by that, but you cannot ignore the drive shaft angle when you're working on your driveline angles. Understanding these two working angles, where the drive shaft meets the pinion yoke and the drive shaft meets the transmission yoke, you cannot ignore those angles. And let's talk a little bit more about drive shaft angles. Here is a very rudimentary, exaggerated drawing on why I want to talk about and why you must consider the engine transmission angle, the drive shaft angle, and the pinion angle whenever we're talking about driveline angles. In the first example here, let's say the engine and transmission is sitting level at 0 degrees, and the drive shaft is coming downhill a half a degree to pointing to the pinion. In this situation, for 4-link cars, I generally shoot for a 2-degree resting pinion angle negative. In other words, I want to point the pinion down so that as the chassis works and the car and chassis go through the suspension travel, my goal is to set the pinion at around 2 to 2.5 degrees at rest, so that under load and we have the rotation of the chassis and everything else going on, that these are parallel to each other. What's important is, with a 2-degree pinion angle, whenever I launch the car and hit it, then this angle is going to come up, and the front end is more than likely going to stay down, or if I'm pulling the front wheels, I got to take that into consideration. But ideally, I'm shooting for about a 2 to 2.5 degree offset. Now, the working angle here between the transmission and the drive shaft is a half a degree. The working angle here between the drive shaft and the pinion is 2.5 degrees. And I've got a half degree here. So I have a 2-degree difference in working angles at rest. But under load, this is going to come up and collapse, and this 2.5 degrees is going to go more to like 1 degree. And now I'm going to be within a half a degree working angle between the two ends of the drive shaft, and I'm not going to be introducing non-uniform velocity into my drivetrain. Let's take an extreme example that I have actually gotten in emails from viewers. An engine and transmission sitting at a 5-degree angle down towards the rear of the car, and they know they need the pinion to be 5 degrees up under load so that the two center lines are parallel. But when I began to investigate the drive shaft angle, in more than one example, I've had a 5-degree angle of the drive shaft coming up towards the pinion. So let's look at this. What's the working angle here? Because these are opposing angles, in other words, the angles are going in opposite directions, you have to add these two together. This is a 10-degree working angle. This is also, under load, if set properly, is going to be a 10-degree working angle. So they're parallel. However, what I'm telling you is that much of a working angle is not ideal. It's not ideal in drag racing. You are introducing extreme loads on the universal joints of your driveline angle, and this is not what I'm shooting for. You can set up your driveline angles however you want to. So you may say, well, Kevin, what the heck would you do to correct this? I would change the angle of the engine and transmission and get this more under control. I don't want a 5-degree engine transmission angle pointing down towards the rear of the car, nor do I want a 5-degree angle of it pointing up. I'm looking for a balanced combination for my driveline angles to keep non-uniform velocity under control. And at the end of the day, I'm trying to get the engine and transmission center line, the drive shaft center line, and the pinion center line all in a straight line. That's the goal I'm shooting for. And in this situation, even though your pinion and engine center lines are parallel, which means you're working very good to control non-uniform velocity, these working angles are too extreme for full out drag racing, and this is not what I'm shooting for. You cannot and you should not ignore drive shaft angle so that you can understand the drive shaft and pinion working angle and the transmission and drive shaft working angle. Those two working angles are critical to understand. And at the end of the day, I don't want these two angles being more than 2 degrees difference under acceleration. That's my approach. This is how I approach driveline angles. A couple other key points. On my 4-link cars, I'm shooting for 2, maybe 2.2, no more than 2.5 degrees of pinion offset to this parallel center line situation. On ladder bars, I'm generally between 2 and 2.5 degrees as well. On my leaf spring cars, I'm generally somewhere between 3.5 to 4, maybe 4.5 degrees, just because of the excessive or increased axle wrap that you see with leaf spring cars. Radial cars are different than slick cars. On a radial car, you can look at a video in the description below of a great view of the rear end of a radial launch, a 3-second or a high 3-second drag radial car run, and you can watch the rear separate and watch what happens to the pinion and the drive shaft working angle as the chassis separates going down the track, and you watch what happens to the drive shaft and pinion during this separation process. I can tell you right now, for most of my radial cars, I'm going to set the droop on the rear end. I'm going to let the rear end hang to about where I'm going to have the amount of separation, and then I'm going to check the pinion angle, and I'm trying to get the pinion and the drive shaft and the transmission in a straight line at full droop. And then when the car comes down at rest, the pinion angle is what it is. But as long as I know the rear is going to separate to the point to where I know it's going to separate, then I'm going to let the rear end droop, and I'm going to set the pinion at that droop level, understanding what's happening to the chassis on that anti-squat. A slick car, if you have a slick car, a big tire slick car that's introducing a little squat, then you can take the opposite of what this radial video is showing you, and you can see what the chassis is doing as a big tire car goes into squat. And you can see what's happening to your working angle there. Okay, let me jump in here real quick. I'm editing this video and I'm not happy with some of my explanations, so I wanted to drop in here real quick and clarify a few things. If you want you to focus on a slick car for right now, where you may have some rear end squat going on. So if you think about, and I said earlier that normally on a big tire slick car, we generally have a level or a little bit of an uphill angle on the engine and transmission going towards the rear of the car. Now that angle's extreme, but like I said, generally we're between 0 to 1, maybe 1.5 degrees of engine transmission angle going up towards the rear of the car, for especially a big tire slick car. If you think about the chassis dynamics going on, why might we do that? One, on a big tire slick car, I'm trying to keep the center of gravity as low as I can, so that I'm not hitting the wheelie bars extremely hard. I generally run in a little longer instant center unless I have some really high dollar shocks, or I'm running a lot of air on the extension of the shocks to not let the rear end separate and upset the big tire sidewall. But why might we do that? If you think about a big tire chassis, generally you're going to have some squat on the rear end to keep the big tires slick happy and the sidewalls happy. So if you think about the launch, now obviously if you're pulling the front wheels up, so as the front wheels come up, the front of this angle is coming up, and as you introduce squat, the rear end of the car, the chassis, the rear chassis of the car is coming down. Well, the motor and transmission are attached to the chassis, obviously. So if the front end's coming up and the rear end is coming down, now obviously the rear end's coming down more because you're further away from the front wheel pivot point. Obviously this is, let's say that's the front wheel and the car is pivoting down off of this pivot point, but the front end's coming up. So in essence, on a big tire slick car, if you have a little uphill angle towards the rear, on the launch and through the run, this uphill angle is actually becoming parallel to some degree, okay? I mean, we're talking at a high level here. And if you think about it, as the chassis comes down and the drive shaft yoke at the transmission, that angle is the transmission's coming down, and as the rear pinion is trying to rotate up, then you're bringing things in line. So when you look at a big tire slick car, and we may run a 1 degree engine transmission angle up towards the rear end, I'm going to have the pinion at rest pointing down 2 degrees, because as the pinion tries to rotate up, it's going to, with the instant center on a big tire slick car, it's going to introduce this squatting in the rear, the front coming up. So as this levels out, it's going to actually create a situation where this is in line with a level engine and transmission angle. I know I'm not doing this justice, but I wanted to come back and talk about this. So just the opposite is true with a radial car. So I have a lot of success with some radial cars that are running a little bit of a downhill angle towards the engine and transmission, say 2 degrees. And if you think about a radial car, as the chassis comes up and separates, it's pulling the back of the transmission angle up, and it's driving the front angle down, which is going to level out that angle. And remember, take a look in the description and look at the video of that drag radial car and what's going on with the working angle of the drive shaft and the pinion. Take a look at that. But I wanted to pause and come back here and kind of just explain the chassis dynamics that are at play on a big tire car or a radial car and how that impacts angles. Obviously, when the front end is coming up off the ground and you're rotating on the rear axle, you're changing angles too. Obviously, we're not carrying the wheels all the way through the 8th mile. So, we're carrying the front wheels maybe, anywhere from 40 to 80 to 100 feet. And then, but the front end is still, canted up, and a big tire slick car, the squat is relaxing. But this is why some of the dynamics are at play on the chassis. So I just wanted to break in here real quick and kind of explain this a little better than I did. Of course, with driveline angles, guys, I have to assume that everyone understands that the engine and transmission should be centered between the frame rails. It's very important that the crank and the engine yoke are centered between the frame rails of your drag car. I don't think I should have to go into a lot of explanation on why that is. You don't want your engine and transmission angle doing this, and then your pinion angle kind of doing this. That's ridiculous, right? We're really shooting for a centered pinion and a centered engine transmission angle. So getting these centered in your chassis, I have to just kind of, make sure you guys understand that's just a given. If these are not centered left or right in your chassis, then start there. Let's get that corrected. Let's get the driveline centered between the frame rails. And I like a centered pinion. I don't like an offset pinion left or right. I prefer a centered pinion, which is why in the Studebaker I have two different length axles, because we want the pinion centered in the chassis. And the engine crank, the back of the crank, the front of the transmission, and the back of the transmission are all in a straight line, centered in the chassis. Like I said, look at the description. Look at the videos I have in the description. I have supporting material in the description of the YouTube video to help cover some of these topics. But at the end of the day, on my previous videos, I'm talking about dedicated drag cars and primarily big tire slick cars that don't generally run a 5-degree downhill angle. Most of the drag cars that I work with, big tire slick cars, are 0 to maybe 1 degree angle towards the rear of the car, where the crank is actually a little lower than the transmission yoke. And that's what we generally see on big tire slick cars. But predominantly, most of the big tire slick cars we work with are between 0 to 1 degree up towards the rear of the car. Very rarely do I see extreme angles like this. Some of my small tire slick cars, they may have about a 1 degree downhill angle, and a lot of my no prep cars are running a little bit of a 1 degree or 1.5 to 2 degree downhill angle, because they're trying to get the crankshaft higher in the chassis so that they have more force to bring the weight transfer to the rear of the car. In a big tire slick car, I'm not really trying to get a lot of front end weight transfer, but on a small tire, especially a no prep car, I may bring the center line of the engine and transmission up in the chassis and even have about a 1 degree downhill angle, as long as I have the drive shaft pointing to the yoke and not some crazy offset between the drive shaft distance and the yoke distance. These are very general things though, but I felt like I had to cover and go through driveline angles one more time, because I talk about pinion angle, and in my previous videos I was making a bunch of assumptions around this. Those videos weren't necessarily meant for big Chevrolet trucks, long bed trucks with crazy engine angles and all this kind of stuff. So I felt like I needed to come back and go through this. Hey, thank you for bearing with me through this. I don't ever want to be rude or speak down to anyone. It's not my nature. I very much appreciate the support of this channel, and I'm excited about getting the Studebaker back out soon, and we're going to definitely get that car in the 4-second zone. Just remember, we're talking about all this to do 3 things. We want to go fast, we want to go straight, and more importantly, we want to be safe. Thank you, guys.
Tu